Today we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Vav. Today's daf is dedicated by Sarah Borelowitz in honor of Rabbanit Michelle and my fellow Zoomers on the milestone of finishing Eruvin and starting a new Masechet. We're going to start at Pesachim Daf Vav at the bottom of Hey Amud Bet. What we saw at the end of the daf yesterday was this issue of something of a Gentile being in your reshut, and when is it going to be forbidden and when is it going to be allowed? We said there seems to be this contradiction. It said you can't bal yera'eh, you can't see. Lecha, you can't see your own, but you can see something of someone else's, meaning if it's a non-Jews. But then it said that you can't accept pikdono from nochrim. You can't accept something from a Gentile to watch over. So how does that work out? So we distinguish between if you take responsibility, you assume responsibility for the item versus if you don't. If you have no responsibility for the item, if it were to get lost or stolen, then you're not responsible and then it's not yours and then it's no problem on Pesach. If you assume responsibility, then it's going to be a problem because it's somewhat yours. And now this is going to be the issue that we're going to grapple with exactly for the next little while, which is how much is it yours? How much isn't it yours? Do we consider this yours in other areas? How does this work? So the Gemara starts off 3 lines from the bottom. We're going to have 2 versions of the sugya. There's going to be a few things we're going to see today in 2 different versions. Hani chalamanda amar. This works well if you hold by. Okay, we're now going to understand there's a machloket about a different, in somewhere else this comes up. It's called davar hagorem lemamon. Okay, I'll give you some examples of davar hagorem lemamon. Davar hagorem lemamon means something that causes a financial responsibility or causes or can cause a financial has something of meaning financially. For example, a check. A check has no inherent value, but it has value because it's representative of money. You could actually call all money like this in essence, right? Our money now isn't the weight of the money that makes it what it is, right? Or the value of the item itself. So it's something that causes mammon. So if let's say somebody rips up a check of mine, that's basically causing me a financial loss. So if we say, now the question is, now another example of it would be our case, which is, if I have the Nochri's Pikadon in my possession, okay, the Gentile gives me something to watch. If I have to assume financial responsibility for it, meaning it's not mine right now, it's just sitting in my house, I'm watching it. But if it gets stolen, I have to pay for it. Is that considered mammon? It's money, okay, because theoretically I have responsibility for it. So if you hold davar hagorem lemamon kimamon dami, then I understand why you're going to be obligated on Pesach for seeing this, because it's considered yours for this to a certain extent. Ela laman damar lav kimamon dami. But if you side on the other side of this machloket and you think it's not money, then ma'i kalamemar, then how can you possibly say that you're obligated for seeing this on Pesach? So the answer, shanehacha damar lo yimatzeh. This is a chidush of the Torah. In other words, even if you say davar gorem lemamon is not mammon, in this situation, the Torah said, I don't care that it's not mammon, you are obligated anyway. It's a special, and this is when we get into the realm of what we call chidush. It's a chidush of the Torah. That's the whole idea. Okay. Now with the last line in Hamud Bet, Ika da Amri. Some people say that the sugya reads differently. It's dafka the opposite. The way we end is the way we're going to start here. It makes perfect sense if you hold it's not considered mammon. That's why we needed a special drasha to tell you you're obligated. But if you hold, now it sounded very logical the first time, but now the first way we read it, now it sounds so much more logical this way. If we say in general that anything that you have financial responsibility for could potentially become some financial responsibility, then obviously, and we say it's mammon, that means basically it's yours. That means, of course, you're going to be obligated and you can't have it in the non-Jews. You don't need a special pasuk of lo yimatzeh to teach you that. It's obvious. So they say, no, it's not so obvious. Itztrich, dalkadat hachamina, ho'il v'chi ite, hadar be'ene, la birshutekai kamash malan. No, you might say like this. While it's true that while I'm watching this item of the Gentile, if something were to happen to it, I would have to pay. So that's true. I have some financial responsibility. But in the end, If nothing happens to it, what happens? I return it to the Gentile, and it was not mine ever, really. I was just watching it. So it's kind of got this in between. On the one hand, I have responsibility for it. On the other hand, even if we call it mamon, in other words, I have financial rights to it, it's still not mine, because if nothing happens to it, I return it as is, which is probably likely what's going to happen. So therefore, you might have thought you're not obligated on Pesach if you see it. So they come to teach you, no, you can't have this with you on Pesach. Because they're talking about this issue of a non-Jew having rights to something of yours, or you having rights to something of the Gentiles in this case, we're now going to talk about two other issues. Okay, when it comes to animals, you're supposed to bring the firstborn of your animals to the Kohen. You give it as a gift to the Kohen. Likewise, you're supposed to do hafrashat challah, right? We all know hafrashat challah. You take a piece of your bread, right? Nowadays we don't, right? You're making a dough. They would give a part of it to the Kohen. Now, both of these things, this is a drasha from verses in the Torah where it says specifically Yisrael. It's only if it's fully owned by a Jew. But if you, let's say, own a bakery with a Gentile, okay, you're part owners, you're not obligated in challah. If you own animals together with Gentiles, you're not obligated in bechor. So the Gemara asks the following question. So they asked Rava, and they want to know from Rava. They say, Behemat Arnona. Okay, what's Behemat Arnona? Behemat Arnona is, Arnona, if you live in Israel, you know it means taxes. So what does this mean? This is if you live in a city where they take as tax the firstborn of your animals. So if that's the case, then your firstborn is partly, now the Gentile hasn't taken it yet, but when that animal is born, are you chayav to give it to the Kohen? Or since the Gentile might take it from you for tax, okay, now the issue becomes a little bit that theoretically, they could take any of your animals. It's just that they have rights to the bechor. So they might not necessarily demand your bechor, your firstborn, but they theoretically have rights to it. So maybe, are they considered a partner with you and you're not obligated? So that's what they asked Rava. So now they distinguish. There's different ways that they could take taxes. If what it means when they have this Behemat Arnona, there's two ways they could take this tax. They could either come and physically take the animal, or they could say, pay me the value of the animal. Okay, we have rights to it. We don't really need the animal. We want the financial value. So if they could, matzeh means they could misalik le bezuze. They could take it with money, not necessarily that they're going to take the animal. Then obviously you're going to be chayav because they don't really have rights to that animal. But the question was asked, the question was asked when they're not going to necessarily take it with money, or they don't take it with money, meaning they take the animal itself. In that case, again, it breaks down to, do we say since they're likely going to take the bechor, therefore they have rights to the bechor and therefore you're not obligated? Or since theoretically they could take some other animal from your herd, then maybe they won't. So maybe they're not. So Amarlehu P'tura. Rava says, you're exempt. It's as if they have rights to it. But then they say, V'hatanya chayevet, but wait, isn't there a braita? We question Rava and say, it says you're obligated. So they say, Hatam demasik masalik le. No, you could just say that braita that said chayevet was in a case where they take money instead, or they likely will take money instead of the animal. That's the first way of reading the sugya. I promised you we'd have a few cases where we're going to read the sugya 2 times in a different way the second time. Ika da Amre, some people say that Amarava behemat arnona p'tura min bechora va'af al gav dematze mesalikle. He says that behemat arnona is always going to be exempt, even if they might potentially take money. They still have rights to that animal, in which case we're going to exempt you no matter what. Then he says, though, Isat Arnona, according to this version, he distinguishes between a Behemat Arnona and an Isat Arnona. Isa is a doe of Arnona, which would be a case where they basically say, we're taking, a certain portion of all your bread. Chayevet bechala. In that case, you have to take chala. Afal gav de lo matze mesalikle. Even if they always take bread, they're not interested in the finances. It's not like they want the value of the bread. They want actual bread. You're still obligated to do hafrashat challah. Now, why is that? My taima, behema it lakala, isa late lakala. When it comes to an animal, Everybody knows. Meaning, everybody understands that when you have an animal, that the firstborn generally gets taken by the Gentiles. So therefore, when they see that you're not taking Bechor, this all comes into the realm of what we call Marit Ayin, or some people say Maris Ayin, right? Where it's basically people will look at you and say, oh, you're not doing something, and then they'll either look not nicely upon you, or you might cause other people to think they don't have to do it, right? If you don't do it, then I don't have to do it. That's a classic, behavioral. People see other people doing something and then they say, oh, I don't have to do this either. So now the question is, when you have the animals, everybody knows that they take them for taxes. But isa leit la kala, but if the Gentile is taking part of your bread, nobody really knows that. It's not something that spreads around, and it's not something most of your loaves that doesn't happen with. So, right, most people bake bread. It's not like the Gentile has a part of it. So therefore, it's not as obvious, and therefore people will see that you're not taking your challah, and they won't know why, and it will cause problems. Okay, again, they don't really get into what exactly the problem is of people seeing you, but they say the difference. That's the difference between the two, according to this version. Tanu Rabbanit. Again, more issues with Gentiles. We're now going to get into a few different situations with a Gentile and chametz, and are you obligated or not? Nochri comes into your courtyard on Pesach, ubitse kobiado, holding his dough in his hand, right? He's holding dough or whatever kind of chametz he's holding. Ein zakuk leva'er. You don't have to go over and immediately burn it. Hif kido etzlo, but if he gave it to you to watch, we already learned this, zakuk leva'er. You have to get rid of it on Pesach. Yiched lo bayit, however, if he wants to leave something for you to watch and you say, listen, I'm giving you this house, take this house, put your item in it. Now, this is kind of like saying, I'm not assuming responsibility. I'm giving you a space. That space is yours. You could put your items in it. You can store it there, no problem. If that's the case, ein zakuk leva'el. You don't have to burn it. Why? Shenema. Again, burning here might not necessarily mean burn. It means you don't have to get rid of it. You have to make sure to return it to him before Pesach. Obviously, you're not going to burn someone else's chametz. Shenema lo yimatzeh. Okay, because it says lo yimatzeh, that's how we learn that. Okay, now this is very strange. What do you mean? From lo yimatzeh, we learn that if you gave him a house, then it's okay to keep it. So we're going to struggle with this drashad. This is exactly a mirror image of the sugya we saw yesterday, or not a mirror image, but the same type of sugya that we saw yesterday, where we had this verse and we didn't understand. This seems like it's forbidding, but it sounds like it's permitting. It doesn't make much sense. Lo yimatzeh sounds like a lo taseh. It's a problem. And yet we're saying it's allowed. So we're going to have two explanations, just like we had yesterday. Maika Amar, how do you get it from this pasuk? What's it talking about? Amar Papa Arei Shakai. Oh, this pasuk was referring to the beginning part, really not the beginning, but the middle part, which was the case that's forbidden. If you give it to the Gentile to watch, the Gentile gives it to you to watch, then it's forbidden. And that's because if he gave it to you to watch, and again, assuming you assumed responsibility for it. Zakuk leva'el, shenemar lo yimatzeh. So he basically says, don't read the pasuk lo yimatzeh on the last part where it sounds like it's going, right? It's like a misplaced modifier. It really goes earlier. Rav Ashi amar la'olam ha'seifakai. Rav Ashi says, no, I'm going to read it according to the simple reading. The hachi kamar, but this is how you should read it. Yiched lo bayit ein zakuk leva'el, shenemar lo yimatzeh bivatechem. Notice what word they forgot to mention. Lo yimatzeh bebatechem. And this is very common when they quote psukim in the Gemara. Oftentimes they don't quote the most important words in that verse. First of all, chances are they assumed that you knew the whole verse by heart, because people just knew Torah much better than we do. So when they quoted that word, the beginning of the pasuk, they assume that you know the end of the pasuk, even though the end of the pasuk is what's important. Sometimes it's just a printing issue. Could be, a manuscript issue. The people in the manuscript wrote lo yimatzeh v'chulei, and then the v'chulei got dropped, or they just wrote it shorthand because they were writing everything by hand, and it was a pain to write out everything, the whole verse. So again, figuring them anyway, they just wrote it, okay, and then. But the real important word was bebatechem. Right? V'halav didehu denochri ki kama ayel lebeta denafshe kama ayel. When you yiched lo bayit and you give the Gentile a room or a house, you're basically saying that house is yours. So it's no longer lo yimatzeh bebatechem. Lo yimatzeh bebatechem means it can't be found in your houses. This is as if it's really no longer your house. Okay, which is going to lead us to our next issue. Lememar, are you trying to say here, Deschirut Kanya, that if you rent someone a space, because it's as if you're renting them that space to store their stuff. So if you do that, are we saying that whoever rents acquires the space and it's no longer your space? Well, we're going to have a problem with that. This is like the sugi we talked about the who's obligated, the renter or the owner, right? The landlord, who's supposed to do bedika. And then we said, for example, mezuzah is chovat hadar. It's whoever's living there. So if you rent, it's yours for the purposes of mezuzah. So now also it sounds like if you give them a house to put their stuff in, you're not obligated lo yimatzeh because it's not bebatechem. It sounds like they own it. Well, we're going to have a problem because it says in the following Mishnah, af b'makom, now this is in Avodah Zarah. Okay, in Masechet Avodah Zarah, it talks about the issue, and this is a very interesting issue. I have to go more in depth to figure out because we obviously do things like this. Af b'makom she'amru la'askil lo lebeiti amru mipnei shemachnisim letocho avodah zarah. When they said that you can rent something to a Gentile, something that you own, you cannot rent them a house. Okay, here it says you can't rent a house to a Gentile. What's the concern? Because they're going to bring into the house Avodah Zarah. What can you rent to them? A storage house. We're not worried that they're going to put their idols in a storage house, but we are concerned that they're going to put idols in the house that you gave them. And it's a problem if you live in that house, if you own that house, for there to be Avodah Zarah in that house. Okay, now, they're going to say, the Isakadataf, the Schiru Kanya, if you say whoever rents it, they become the owner, basically, they acquire rights to it, this shouldn't be a problem. Ki kama ayel lebete denafshe kama ayel, right? Once they put it in, it's their own house. And that's basically raising an issue on our sugya. This is a very interesting issue. I actually have a neighbor who is very careful only to rent their house to religious people who keep halacha. They don't want any, they want Shomer Shabbos people. It's, now this isn't a law, okay, but it's this concept that they feel like we own the house. We want things to go on in this house the way we want them to go on. Right? This isn't typical, but it does happen. So it's the same idea with Avodah Zarah. Now, this whole sugya could be much, there's not that many people that actually worship idols anymore. There are still people, but the question is that even the idol worship that it's referring, the whole issue of idol worship is much less prevalent. And, so therefore, this whole sugya is really the issue of idols, if you want to say, well, I can't rent to Gentiles, the whole sugya, this needs more work. We'll get to it more in depth when we get to Avodah Zarah. Okay, we'll leave it at that. But the question for our purposes is, it sounds from that sugya like you're still responsible. And yet, you're not chayav in Bal Yimatzeh. So what do they say? Just like we said earlier today, Bal Yimatzeh, Lo Yimatzeh is a special drasha. We can use it in a special way. So they say like this, Shanehacha de afke rachmana b'lashon lo yimatzeh. Notice the wording the Torah used. Lo yimatzeh means it should not be found. It doesn't say don't own it, don't have it. It says lo yimatzeh misha matzor biyadcha. It has to be found in your possession or in your hands, which means you have to have access to it. This really isn't yours because you've given it to the Gentile entirely. So even though we might say schirut is not koneh, but for the purposes of chametz b'Pesach, it's not under the category of lo yimatzeh because it's not really found to you because it's really you gave the Gentile access to the house and they're kind of responsible for it. So again, darshaning this lo yimatzeh, it's like a special law only for this, and you can't really question it from other cases. We're now going to have a slew of halachot of Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, hamotzei chametz bebeito b'yom tov. What happens if you find chametz in your house on Yom Tov, like that story I said with the Suda Shlishit in the shul, and they left the whole, the whole meal in the shul, and they came and found it on Yom Tov. So what do? If it's Chol HaMoed, you burn it. But if it's Yantif, what's the issue? Well, you might say the issue is burning, but it's not really such an issue burning because it's what we call litzorech. You're allowed to burn things if you have a need for it for the holiday. Now, finding chametz on Pesach, to burn it is a need of the holiday. It's a mitzvah to burn chametz that you find on Pesach. So that's really, it doesn't seem to be the issue. The issue is that muktzah, is exactly as Gita said, the issue is muktzah. That chametz is muktzah. Now, muktzah, remember, is only rabbinic in nature. And that brings Rashi to say, it must be that your chametz is rabbinic in nature. How could that be? if you already did bitul. We're talking about a case where you already nullified all your chametz, which means you're not really owning it. So therefore, so now we have two things conflicting. On the one hand, if we go to burn it, we have to deal with muktzah items, which is forbidden by the rabbis. On the other hand, if we leave it, we're obligated midirabanan, because midirabanan, you shouldn't have chametz in your house, even though you did bitul, right? That's why we check our chametz and we get rid of everything, even though you can just nullify everything and say, I don't own this, but we don't really want you to have it. So midirabanan, they said, and that's because maybe you'll find, maybe you'll want to eat it. We don't really want it. So if we have this conflict, what's the best thing to do? What we call shev al tasa, just don't do anything, right? And that's, instead of touching something muktzah, rather than leaving something, right? We'd rather just leave the chametz. So we just stick a kli on top of it, and that way we don't have the issue of muktzah. This also, we talked about kufin takli, another connection between the end of the previous Masechet, and you leave it like that. The Rambam, however, disagrees with Rashi, and the Rambam says this is even if you didn't do bitul, which is very interesting, because then you'd have to say that we have a deoraita of getting rid of the chametz, Dirabanan of muktzah, and you'd have to say the chachamim. We learned this before. Chachamim asu chizuk lidivrehem yoter mishal Torah. They took muktzah so seriously that they basically said, even though midoraita there's an issue, just cover it and wait till after Chag. Okay, which is really interesting that they would do such a thing. You would think the chametz Pesach would be much more severe, but maybe because they have some solution, which is you could just cover it and leave it, right? They don't want you, and it's also a shev al taset, just leave it alone, and we can avoid it. So better to do that than to do it. So it's a very interesting machloket here about whether we're assuming you've done bitul or you haven't done bitul. So now Amar Rava. Rava says, wait a minute. Im shel hekdeshu eino tzarich. If it was sanctified food, chametz, then you don't have to burn it. Okay, my time. What's the difference? Mivdal b'dilei minei. The whole concern, okay, is that why do you put the kli on top? Because we're worried you might see it and you might decide you want to eat it. But if it's hekdesh, you know you can't eat hekdesh. Now, what's the difference? Also, chametz, you know you can't eat. But chametz, you eat all year round. Whereas hekdesh, something that's sanctified to the temple, you'll never touch because you know it's sanctified to the temple. It doesn't belong to you. So since it doesn't belong to you, we're not worried you're going to eat it. Whereas chametz, we're worried you might actually eat. Another issue of hekdesh we're going to see right now, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, he says another halacha. Chemso shel nochri, let's say you have chametz of a nochri in a way that's permitted. You should put up a wall. This also connects with last Masechet, right? Mechitza, 10, right? Put up a wall to separate yourself from it. Even though it's technically allowed, we want you to make some sort of separation. Okay. But im shel hekdeshu einot tzarich. But again, if it's hekdesh, you don't need to. My taima mivdal b'dilei inish mineh. Because people keep away from hekdesh. They know it's hekdesh, therefore you don't have to worry about it. One can ask the following question. I'm just going to raise this as a question. Hekdesh, while it's true, okay, you know if something's hekdesh, right, you're going to stay away from it. However, there's a bit of a problem with hekdesh. People don't always know it's hekdesh, right? That's the classic me'ila. Okay, we're going to have a whole Masechet me'ila much later on in the daf, which is all about accidentally using hekdesh property, because sometimes you don't even know that something's hekdesh. It's not like hekdesh. If someone sanctifies food to the temple, I wouldn't necessarily know you've sanctified. It looks the same to me. So it's a bit of a question here. It would have to be a hekdesh that's obviously hekdesh. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit tricky. Okay. Someone asked, would a Gentile's property ever be hekdesh? I think only if, right? The question is, you're saying, can a Gentile sanctify something to the temple? I guess theoretically they could. I would assume if it's the Gentile's property, you can only sanctify it if it's your own. You can't sanctify someone else's property. If you tried to sanctify someone else's property, it wouldn't work because you can only sanctify something that you own. So if you're asking, can a Gentile sanctify and would it be considered hekdesh? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Okay. Tov, is this mechitza why we lock up our chametz? That's a good question. It could be. It could be. Okay. So anyway, these are questions. I don't know the answer if a Gentile can actually sanctify. I don't remember how that works. Okay. I'm sure we'll get to it later. Okay. Next. Here comes a very classic situation, okay? Especially nowadays that people have two houses and they live in different places in either, New York and Florida or Israel and somewhere else in the world. Many people have multiple houses. So what do you do if you're not, you leave that house months before Pesach? Are you supposed to do bi'or chametz from your house? So, right, forget about With now, where people were expecting to come back to their house on before Pesach, didn't, right? And that's a whole other question where you didn't even know. So, and maybe that's part of the issue here. When you leave, you don't exactly know when you're going to come back. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, המפרש והיוצא בשיירה קודם 30 יום אין זקוק לבאר. תוך 30 יום זקוק לבאר. It all depends on how long before Pesach you left. If it's within 30 days before Pesach and you're leaving your house, you have to take care of biur chametz. If you're leaving before that, then you don't have to take care of biur chametz. Now, one aspect they forgot to mention in this statement was, are you planning to come back before Pesach? Are you not? What's the situation? So Abai and Rav have a machloket about this. Amar Abai, had amar toch 30 yom zakuk levaer. The fact that we say if you leave within 30 days before Pesach, you have to get rid of all your chametz. Lo amaran ela shadato lachzor. We're only talking about if you were intending to go back before Pesach. Aval ein dato lachzor ein zakuk levaer. You don't have to do biur chametz if you're not even planning to come back there on Pesach. Okay, what this means exactly is a good question. Does this mean you can leave chametz in your house, right? We all know that we sell our chametz if we're planning to leave it, right? But it's a good question what exactly it means. Ein zakuk levaer. So just one second. Just want to see. Right, Rashi says, to live today. Right. No, he doesn't really say. Okay, so now, but it seems like you have to make sure your chametz is not going to be there anymore. So Abai says like this: if it's toch 30 yom, right then, the whole thing of ein zakuk levaer is only if you're planning to come back. You have to get rid of it if you're planning to come back before Pesach. But he claims there's basically going to be 4 possibilities: before and after, right? You're leaving before 30 days or within 30 days, and you're planning to come back or not planning to come back. So he says the only case where you have to get rid of it is if you're leaving within 30 days and you're planning to come back before Pesach. But all the other 3 options, before 30 days, planning to come back, or not planning to come back at all, then you don't have to get rid of it. Amar Rava. He brings this extreme example. Even if you left your house from Rosh Hashanah and you're planning to come back on Pesach, of course you have to get rid of your chametz. How could you possibly not have to get rid of your chametz if you're planning to come back to your house on Pesach? He says when we say ein zakuk levaer is only, you don't have to get rid of it if you left before 30 days before Pesach, okay, meaning not within 30 days, and you're not planning to come back. That's the only case you don't have to levaer. But all other 3 possibilities, aval dato lachzor, afilu me'rosh hashanah zakuk levaer, and if you're within 30 days and you're not planning to come back, all those cases he thinks you have to get rid of it anyway. But as the Rava l'tameh, and Rava goes l'shitato, because we're going to see the Amar Rava. If you make your house an otsar, what does that mean? It means, okay, it's not exactly what it sounds like. You have chametz and you pile on top of it all your grain to store it. And you store it on top of some chametz, okay? So he says like this. It depends what day you did this. If it was kodem 30 yom, if it's 30 days before Pesach, ein zakuk levaer. You can leave that chametz at the bottom of the pile. We don't care. Because what's the assumption? 30 days before Pesach, you don't have to be thinking about Pesach and the fact that there's stuff buried under here. And likely you're not going to take off all that grain and on Pesach access, right? It's not very accessible. But toch 30 yom, but if you do it 30 days before, within the 30 days before Pesach, zakuk levaer. You can't dump all your grain on top of this chametz. You'd have to get rid of the chametz. V'kodem 30 nami lo amaran, and here comes his big thing, which we're going to say that connects with our sugya, which is when we say before 30 you can do it. That's only she'ein da'ato lefanoto. That's only if you're not planning to remove all that grain before Pesach or on Pesach. Aval da'ato lefanoto. But if you're planning to undo that pile, then afilu kodem 30 yom nami zakuk levaer. Even earlier in the year, you're going to have to get rid of it. And you can't leave this pile with chametz underneath if you're planning to undo that pile. Some people ask that there's a problem because there's some other sugya that talks about if there's an avalanche and it falls on your chametz, basically that's biuro. It's as if it's destroyed. So why wouldn't we say the same thing here with the pile, right? It's basically buried under this pile. It's kind of like a mapolet. So what's the difference? There's a very big difference. A mapolet happened. You didn't do it. Here, you're doing it what we call lechatchila. That's b'diavad. That kind of happens. So, okay, we say, fine, leave it. This is you're creating a pile and you're putting it on top of chametz. You can't do that intentionally, according to Rava, if you plan to undo that pile before Pesach or around Pesach. Okay, so there we see that Rava goes l'shitata. Now they're going to say, everyone agrees that there's some significance to the 30 days before Pesach. Where did they get that from? What's this 30 days? Kiditanya, as we see in the following braita, this is very famous. And shoalim v'dorshim b'ilchot Pesach kodma Pesach shloshim yom. You're supposed to start learning Hilchot Pesach 30 days before. Immediately what comes to my mind is right after Sukkot in Israel, they immediately start putting out sufganiyot, right, for Hanukkah, right? We're getting near Hanukkah, right? Immediately they start selling, and after Hanukkah, they start selling oznei Haman, humintashin, right? It's like, oh, we're done with this, next, right? So right after Purim, they're telling you, start learning about Pesach, okay? Why? Now, there's a big debate. Is this all holidays? You're supposed to start learning about the holiday 30 days before, right? I was kind of just saying a joke about it's really a marketing thing. They just try to sell stuff in the bakeries. So they start saying, oh, get ready, the next Chag is coming. But the question is, are you supposed to basically go and, are you supposed to start learning about every holiday, or is it just Pesach because there's so many halachot associated with it? So there's a debate about this. But anyway, it says here, he says you only need 2 weeks. Now, what's the issue here? Is he just saying you don't need 30 days? Or is he saying, no, you should only start 2 weeks? You shouldn't start earlier. Why? Think about it. When you learn things, okay, maybe Daf is the best example. When you learn things, when they're fresh in your mind, right? Do you remember a Daf that we learned 2 weeks ago? Unlikely, right? Because what you learn is what's in your head at the time. And you're better off learning closer to the day. If you start learning so early, who's going to remember the details when you get there? So therefore, he says, don't start a month before. That's way too early. Okay. Or I'll give you another example. You send an invitation. If I get an invitation 2 months before the event, if I forget to put it in my calendar, I'm going to forget about that event. Right. But if you send me it the week of, I'll remember, right? Even if I forget to put it in my calendar, it'll be in my head. But something that's so far in advance, at least for me, I'm very forgetful. I'll usually forget about it. So that's the debate between them. Or should you really start early? Because number one, your head should be into it. Number two, right? You want to be focusing on the holiday. First of all, it's a way of kind of extending the holiday. And also there's a lot of details to get to. So, start learning early. So anyway, now we're going to see what's their source, okay? And this is where the 30 days connects, because according to Tanakama, 30 days before, you're already supposed to be in the mindset of Pesach, right? You can think about your house, right? Generally, I know lots of people say, oh, you're eating there, it's, Pesach is coming. But when it's, now, nobody thinks about, oh, don't eat there, Pesach is coming. But 30 days before, everyone's in the mindset of, oh, be careful with your chametz because Pesach is coming. So it's the same idea. So now they say, my time at Tanakama. And they're now going to show the proofs that people bring from Psukim. Sharei Moshe omed bepesach rishon umazhir al pesach sheni shene'emar. Okay, here if we look in Bamidbar, Perek Tet, the 9th Perek of Bamidbar, it says, "Vayasu b'nei Yisrael et pesach b'moado." Okay, soon we're going to see the first verse of that section. We're going to darshan that also. It starts off. I'll already read it to you because we're going to read it soon. So God spoke to Moshe in the desert, in the Sinai desert. Bashana Shenit, in the second year, L'Teitam Eretz Mitzrayim, the second year they got out of Egypt is basically like the first Pesach they're going to really celebrate after the first Pesach when they got out. B'chodesh harishon lemor. And it gets the first month, right? The first month, which is Nisan. And then it says, and they do the Pesach b'moado. And he tells them, keep Pesach. And then what happens? Some people come forward and say, hey, listen, we're Tme'im. We can't do Pesach. What do we do? And remember, Moshe doesn't know what to do. He goes to God. God tells him Pesach Sheni. And then Moshe proceeds to tell them all the laws of Pesach Sheni. He doesn't just tell them, and this is where they're going to basically say from here, what do you see? He tells them all the laws of Pesach Sheni. Okay, we're going to read that here. There were people who were tamei, and they don't tell you the rest, but the rest is, and then Moshe explained to them what they're supposed to do on Pesach Sheni, which is in a month from now. So you see, he gave them the laws of Pesach Sheni a month in advance. That must be to teach you, or we can at least derive from here that you should teach the halachot a month in advance. Now, this is a little strange. It all happened a month in advance, not because Moshe decided I'm going to teach you the laws of Pesach Sheni a month in advance. It's because the people asked, it was Pesach, and they said, what are we supposed to do? And then Moshe told them. So a bit of a question, but they say, Moshe could have just said, there's a concept of Pesach Sheni, I'll teach it to you in a month from now, or in 2 weeks from now. But instead, it goes through, and if you look at the Pesukim there, it goes through in detail all the laws. It says, matzot murim yochluhu, you should eat it with matzah and maror. It tells you can't break the bones, and it tells you all sorts of things. Okay, so he didn't need to go into all those details a month before. So from here, you learn it's a month. From Shimon ben Gamliel amar lecha, since it was in the middle of Pesach, so we told them all the other details, but it's not because it needed to be 30 days before in general. So my Tamid Rashbag, where does he get the 2 weeks? Moshe omed berosh hachodesh umasir al Pesach shenemar hachodesh lachem rosh chodeshim uchti dabru kol hadab bnei Israel lemor be'asor lechodesh hazeh v'yikchu lechem ish sel lebeit avot. This is from the 12th chapter of Shemot, when it says, God says, make this your first month, and then he tells them all the halachot of Pesach. This is what we read Parshat HaChodesh, right? We just before Pesach, where we read all the details of what's going to be. So there you see. When did he do this? Presumably on Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so now, how do you know he said this on Rosh Chodesh? Dilma ba'arba b'yarcha o b'chamisha b'yarcha. Okay, maybe he said it on the 4th of the month or the 5th of the month. By the way, this 4 or 5 reminds us of Masechet Shabbat. Remember, if you want to take things out of a storage house, you can take out 4 or 5. It's like a typical 4 or 5 comes up many, many times in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Maybe it was the 4th or the 5th. How do we know it was the first day of the month? So basically, now, it's a little bit weird to say it's not the first day of the month, because God said to Moshe, Chodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodeshim. And from there, we learn all these laws about Rosh Chodesh and making it the first of the month and how you decide the Rosh Chodesh. But it could be that God told Moshe, but it's not so clear that Moshe told the people on Rosh Chodesh. Maybe he waited a few days, like we said, to basically do it closer to the day so that they remember it. So they basically say you can't prove it from there. Must be from here. And that's where I told you we're going to read this verse again from Bamidbar Tet. Vayidaber Hashem Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'shana sheni b'chodesh harishon. Uchtiv v'yasu et haPesach b'moado. Now, I say, here Moshe spoke. Imidbar Sinai, when? On the 2nd year, in the first month. Okay, notice what's missing. Doesn't say what day of the month. It just says the first month. So again, the Gemara is going to say, maybe it was the 4th or the 5th. It didn't say. We're going to learn Gzera Shava from another place where it says B'midbar Sinai. Where is this? In the 1st chapter of Bamidbar. Techtiv hacha b'midbar Sinai. Uchtiv hatam v'yidaber Hashem Moshe b'midbar Sinai ba'ol moed. Says the very beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, when they counted the people, what does it say? Be'echad lachodesh hasheni. It was the 2nd year of getting out of Egypt. It was the first day, be'echad lachodesh hasheni, of the 2nd month. It was the 1st of Iyar. Ma lahalam b'rosh chodesh. So just like there, he spoke to Moshe b'rosh chodesh. Av kam b'rosh chodesh. We assume this was Rosh Chodesh. But now the Gemara is going to go off on a total tangent. So we basically proven it must be Rosh Chodesh. Then he spoke to the people and told them to do the Pesach on the 2nd year. From there, we learn it's actually a better example than from the 1st year, because the 1st year was the 1st year. Maybe it's not indicative of what we're supposed to do for future generations. But the 2nd year, he also started talking to them about Pesach 2 weeks before, so we can prove from there. Even though it doesn't say explicitly, we can learn from Gzera Shava. Now we have a problem. Why does Sefer Bamidbar start off on the 2nd month of the 2nd year? And in Perek Tet, chapter 9, 8 prakim later, it says on the 1st day of the 2nd month, of the 1st month. That seems very out of order. Wouldn't you think the Torah is in order? So here comes very famous sugya. Ein mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. There is no order in the Torah. Amar Rav Menashe bar Tachli. The Gemara asks, V'nichtav b'reisha dechodesh rishon. V'nichtav b'reisha. Why didn't they write first dechodesh rishon? Why didn't Perek Tet come first, right? The Hadran nichtov dechodesh sheni. And then later it should have said what happened. It should have been a chronological. Isn't the Torah chronological? From here we can learn there's no order in the Torah, right? Things are out of order. But Amar Papa lo amaran ela b'trei inyane. Aval b'chad inyana ma'id mukdam mukdam u'ma'id mu'uchar mu'uchar. He says that's only when you're talking about 2 different sections. But within one section, it's all in order. Okay, now why does he say this? Because if you don't say this, now you would think that ein mukdam u'meuchar refers to narrative and not halacha. But they're going to take this to halacha, basically. And they're going to say, if you think the order is not important, then you're going to mess up our whole world of drashot. Why? Because drashot are based on, if you recall, we've learned these before, which is there's what's we call klal uprat. There's a generalization and then something specific. And there's prat uklal. You can start off with something specific and move to a generalization. And each of those, depending on the order, it's darshan differently. Now, if you say the order is not important, then you can flip the order and take a klal uprat and turn it into a prat uklal and come to a totally different conclusion. So that's basically what the Gemara is going to say. If you don't say this, that within one topic, there could be a mess up of order, klal uprat, ein bichlal ela masha beprat, tilma prat uklalu. You can't say that anytime there's something general and then you have something specific, you can't say what we normally say, which is ein bichlal ela masha beprat. It's coming to limit only things that are like the detail. Dilma pratu klalu, because maybe it's a pratu klal, and a pratu klal is it comes to add more things rather than limit. Vitu, and likewise you could say the reverse. Pratu klal, normally we say naseh klal mosif ala prat. The klal comes to add additional things to the prat. Dilma klalu pratu. If you say the order doesn't matter, you could switch a pratu klal into a klalu prat, and the reverse. So ihachi. So now they say, okay, fine. So it must be only when it's two separate sections. Do we say there's no particular order? Within one section, there's clearly a particular order. But we're still going to have a question. Because if that's the case, there also is such a thing as a klalu prat in two different sections. Okay, I'll give you the best example. The best example is the korban mincha, and we're going to learn much more about this when we get to menachot in a number of years, which is there's a section in Vayikra Bet, and there's a section in Vayikra Vav that both discuss the korban mincha, which is a meal offering. And there's a special Zera Shava that they make there between a verse in Parak Bet and a verse in Parak Vav. Now, those are in two different sections, and yet we do a klalu prat. So how could we say this? So Hani Chalamanda Amar klalu prat amaru chakim zemize ein danim oto beklalu prat. Shapir. There's two different opinions about whether you can do Xera Shava klalu prat like this or not. Okay. If you say that you can't do a klalu prat from two separate sections, like the one in Menachot, for example, then this makes perfect sense. And that's why two separate sections, you can say the order is not important. But lamanda amar danim. But if you say you can do a kal v'chomer from two sections that are far apart from each other, ma'ika lememar, what are you going to say here? If you can, then if we say ein mukdam u'meuchar, you could say the Parak Vav really came before Parak Bet, and the order is flipped, and then you can't have that drasha. So they say, afilu lamanda amar danim, hani mili b'chad inyana, ava b'tchei inyana ein danim. It's all by topic. It means if you're within the same topic, even two different sections, like the korban mincha, then the order is important. It's the way it's written in the Torah. But if it's two different issues entirely, like the counting of the people and the talking about Pesach, then you can say the order is not, right? The order is not important. Okay, so in the end, that's how we come to conclude that if it's the same section or if it's the same topic, then it must be in order. If not, then it's not. Although, as I pointed out, it's interesting that they're comparing halacha to narrative, right? Narrative and halacha are very different in the Torah. Okay, last issue for today. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, right? We're still continuing with statements he makes in the name of Rav. Habodek tzarich sheyivatel. Just because you do bedika and check that you have no chametz, you still need to nullify all your chametz. My timer. Maybe crumbs, right? And this is what we always tell people for Pesach. You don't have to go crazy. Crumbs are not chametz. Halo chashive. The crumbs are not significant. You want to get rid of your crumbs because you don't want crumbs in your house. That's one thing. But they're not considered chametz. But maybe you'll say, I lock my house at night to protect everything in my house. Now, it happens, I don't protect my crumbs. It's not like I'm worried someone's going to steal them, but they're within my house that gets locked up. So maybe that turns them into significant because they're in a space that I lock up. Well, you can't say that. The Hatanya, because it says in the Braita, let's say you have unripe figs on the tree that are never going to ripen and they're bad, and you just leave them on your tree. But you have a watchman over your field because of the grapes in your field. Or sofei or you have bad grapes left. You watch your field because of the zucchinis and pumpkin that's in your field, right? Thanksgiving related pumpkins. If you're makpid and you care about them, meaning eventually maybe you will pick them, then if someone steals them, they're obligated, and you're also obligated to take trumot u'masrot on them. But if the balabayit doesn't care about them and isn't ever going to pick them, then if someone steals them, even though you watch your whole field, since you don't care about those, mutarim mishum gezel, if someone steals them, they don't have to replace them, and ptulim mishum ma'asel, you have to take masrot. So what do you see? The fact that I guard a bigger space and there's something insignificant doesn't turn that item into significant. So Amar Rava, Gzeira Shemi Yimtza Gluske Yafa. We mentioned this in Rashi the other day. You might find a beautiful cake, and what might happen before you think to nullify it, right, or get rid of it, you might think, oh, I want to eat that. And in that moment, you're chayav a bal yirai or bal yimatzeh. V'datei yilaveh, right? Your mind is on it. You want to eat it. So now they say, but kimish kacha le live tile. Why don't you just say, if you were to find the Gluske Yafa, cancel, nullify it then? Right? Maybe it'll be on Pesach. Who cares? You can nullify it. They say no, because you can't nullify it on Pesach. Dilma mishkacha la lebater isura. Maybe you'll find it once chametz is forbidden, and once chametz is forbidden. Now this is fascinating. La bereshuta kaima v'lo matzeh mevatel. This actually connects with the beginning of the sugya, the beginning of today's daf about the Gentile. If you find it after the time that it's forbidden, it's no longer in your reshut, and you can't nullify it anymore. And they say, how do we know this? To Amar Rabbi Elazar, Shnei dvarim einam bereshuto shel adam v'asa'ana katuv ki'ilu bereshuto. There's two things that are not owned by you, and yet you're obligated in them. What is that? Eluheim bor bereshut harabim. If you dig a pit, we'll get to this in Bava Kama, in the public domain, it's not mine. I just dug a pit, right? And I walked away. But if somebody falls into there, I'm responsible because I created an obstacle, even though I don't own it. Likewise, chametz mishei shofar mala. Any chametz, when Pesach starts, it's no longer yours anymore. But, so because of that, you can't nullify it. So you're stuck then. You can't do nullifying it after. That's why you have to do the nullification before. However, you are obligated if you find it, right? It's like the Gentiles. It's not really yours, but it is yours because you have responsibility for it, right? You can't keep it. So it's very similar to that. So last issue for today, nivtale ba'arba v'nivtale b'chamesh. So why do we do the bitul after we do b'dika chametz at night? Why don't we do it now? Nowadays, we do it both, right? And there's actually a bit of a different version between both. We'll get to that later. But kevan de lav zman isurahu v'lav zman biurahu dilma pasha v'lo mevatale. We're going to get into all issues here and in some upcoming dapim about human error. We're worried that people might accidentally forget. So once you're already doing this ceremony of b'dika chametz, do it then. If we leave it for the next day, it's not like some ceremonial thing happens. Now, some people, make sure, we're going to eat until the very last minute. So maybe you would say yes. But usually there's nothing ceremonial that happens the morning of Pesach, and we're worried you might get carried away with other things and you might forget. So therefore, they want you to do the bitul at b'dika chametz because you already have a ceremony in there. You won't forget to do it. And that's why they do it there. Okay, but we're going to see, the Gemara is going to ask more questions on this in tomorrow's daf. We'll end here. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone.